Morning, everybody, and after Beth's report, I'm hoping that by the time we get to the European elections and after them, you won't get sick of me appearing in TUC meetings on different subjects. But what I'd like to address really this morning is how important trade unionists are to the European elections and how important they are in terms of the outcome of those European elections. I think we have to start by remembering that the European elections are often ignored by the majority of people. In 2009, we had the lowest turnout in Europe in the UK, and the North East had the lowest turnout in the whole of the UK. The 2009 elections came in the summer after Lehman Brothers crash, and at the same time we had the Westminster expenses scandal coming out day after day, which just had a massive negative impact on the doorstep. It was also probably Gordon Brown's least favourite summer of his working career. So generally it wasn't a happy election in any sense. But the really scary thing, and I'm actually quite pleased that I'm speaking directly after those motions, because although the North East has a proud anti-fascist tradition, and unions have certainly led the way in that tradition, from taking on the BNP, taking the Anne Frank exhibition into workplaces, speaking out against Paolo Di Canio's appointment. We've never ducked the challenge, and we've never had a BNP councillor. We didn't allow a BNP MEP to be elected in 2009, but despite that, the BNP got their second highest proportion of the vote in the North East in 2009. And we have to be extremely vigilant in these European elections about how people on the far right and how the far right are rallying. We also, I think, have to campaign very actively with our colleagues in the North West to ensure that in the next European Parliament we don't let Nick Griffin get back into the European Parliament. His salary is the only thing which is keeping the BNP afloat financially at the moment. And I think a big campaign to get the BNP out of the European Parliament is really key. This year sees the next European election on the 22nd of May, and we're in a slightly different situation than 2009. Thanks to UKIP's rise and Tory infighting around the EU referendum promise, Europe and Britain's place in the EU has been in the news far more regularly than really ever in the past. The European elections fall on the same day as local elections across Tyne and Wear and in Hartlepool. Labour has a poll lead nationally, albeit small, and the coalition government are increasingly unpopular, especially in the north, which has felt the brunt of their spending cuts and attack on the welfare state. There's increasing interest in the European elections, and it's testament what we're seeing on the doorstep across the region, but their outcome depends on whether we can turn that interest into people going out and voting. Turnout is absolutely key. Now, across Europe, and I'm a Confederal Secretary of the European TUC, so I speak in many European countries, and people are extremely angry, and they're looking for a way to channel that anger. This election threatens to bring a wave of far-right and xenophobic parties into the European Parliament in larger numbers than we've ever seen. You'll have heard of Golden Dawn in Greece, maybe Jobbik in Hungary, the National Front in France, Wilders' Freedom Party in the Netherlands, parties which fundamentally set one worker against another and espouse the views which hark back to the 1930s. UKIP is aiming for that vote. They want to join this wave of anger and come first in the UK in these elections. They're already saying that they're going to roll through the North East and get at least 2 North East MEPs. So we have to be clear about what we're facing. And the reality is that in the North East, we're facing 3 Tory parties in these elections. We have the posh Tories in the Conservatives, we have the wet Tories in the Lib Dems, and we've got Tories with facts in UKIP. The main target of all 3 are the rights extended to British workers by the Labour government in 1998. Working time limits, 4 weeks paid holiday, rights for part-time workers, equal treatment at work, information and consultation, rights for agency workers. Rights that this movement fought for are being attacked as red tape at the moment by this government. Red tape that needs cutting. But I was speaking to ambulance workers, the North East ambulance workers in Durham this week, and those rights, particularly in the Working Time Directive and Health and Safety Regulation, are the only things standing between them and really having their working conditions really squeezed to dangerous levels, to emergency levels in order to cut costs. Many of the concerns that people have about precariousness at work are not because these rights are too rigid, which is the argument that we always hear from the CBI, the Institute of Directors, but that they're not enforced properly. We need to ensure that that protection is improved and extended. That's where we should be concentrating our energy, but at the moment our government is doing the absolute opposite. And I'll give you one example. At the moment, in Brussels, MEPs, including the North East current Labour MEP, Stephen Hughes, are negotiating with the Council of Ministers on rules related to posting workers. The Tories and UKIP want to deregulate those rules further. They want to undermine them and undermine the protections, the limited protections that we have extended to migrant workers still further, allowing firms to boost their profits on their backs. The only effect will be to increase the tension in our communities and to increase the seedbed for the far right. That's why those unions affiliated to Labour have joined with campaigning with the European Parliamentary Party to fight for these rights, not the status quo, but improved rights. We've convinced Ed Miliband to make closing the loophole in the Agency Workers Directive, the so-called Swedish derogation, a Labour Party priority. And in the North East, it's only Labour who are capable of taking on UKIP. But our voters tend to stay at home at European elections, and we need to change this. In 1992, as the social chapter was being developed, there were 62 Labour MEPs. Now, I'd take a guess around the room about how many people know how many Labour MEPs there are now. People are complaining that social Europe is stalling. Currently, we have 13 Labour MEPs. We have the same number of MEPs as UKIP got in the last elections. They've lost half of theirs because women left because they're misogynist, and other people left because of expenses scandals. But at the election, we got exactly the same numbers. The North East has 335,000 trade unions, and you have a decisive role to play. We've got to get your vote out. This region, more than any other, has a clear story to tell in these elections, and it's a positive story about Europe. It's a story about investment, jobs and rights. Investment, as we all know, is critically important for our region. Public sector investment levers the private sector to a great degree, but as the Tory Lib Dem coalition channel money ever increasingly to the southeast and the Tory shires before the general election, European money is becoming as critical as it was during the 1980s. In the last 5 years alone, the North East received about £498 million worth of European structural and regional funding, supporting much of our infrastructure, business development and skills and training programmes. In the next 7 years, that funding will underpin, as Beth was saying, setting out what's already on the plans, but that funding will underpin the North East and the Tees Valley LEPS plans. This is public investment drawing in foreign direct investment, as we've seen across the region, whether it's Nissan, Hitachi, SSI, Tata, NIFCO, and the list goes on. And let's be clear that the North East will find it even harder to recover, rebuild, and narrow the gap with the South if we leave the EU or give investors 3 years of uncertainty to a 2017 referendum, as the Tories have proposed. Big local employers like Nissan and Hitachi are clear about the threat to their investment plans. At the new Qashqai launch last week, local managers were explicit that their position in a global company internally bidding for work would be severely undermined if the relationship with their key market was called into question. We have a proud record as a region, as a net exporting region. In terms of of exports, we have the healthiest balance of trade of all the UK regions. And we should be focusing all of our attention on attracting more investment and trade with the EU, not less. Last year we smashed all export records with more than 13.75 billion worth of products sold overseas. Half of that is to the EU. And to throw away one of our major advantages as a region would be really an act of economic self-harm. At Nissan alone, there are 21,000 jobs dependent on our position in the EU. Across the region, there are 140,000 jobs directly dependent on our trade with the EU. At a time when unemployment is falling elsewhere in the country, we should be really wary about putting any job into that level of risk and danger. Rather, our attention should be on creating jobs and opportunities, and especially for our young. It was striking yesterday in the Journal. Martin Callanan, the Tory MEP, and Daniel Hannan had an article about their vision of Europe, and there wasn't one mention of youth employment. So, despite the fact that we have one of the highest youth unemployment figures in the country. That youth unemployment is our key priority, and that's why the European Labour Party, together with the European Trade Union Confederation, has been leading the development of the European Youth Guarantee, a good job, good training or an apprenticeship for every young person unemployed for longer than 4 months. We got the proposals adopted at European level. We got the money, although we didn't get as much as we need, but we got the first block of money, about €6 billion. And now the UK government is blocking implementing it, despite the fact that that money is being earmarked for County Durham and Tees Valley. We have to highlight their sabotage of plans to help our young. Refusing to give a future to young people, a monumental mistake which will damage those young people for the whole of their working lives. And those rights that I mentioned earlier, rather than repatriating employment and social policies, we need to address the weaknesses of our economy by tackling precarious work, by halting the rise of zero-hours contracts and ensuring free movement of workers and services comes with protection for those workers and respect of terms and conditions. It was through unions and the Labour Party working together that we saw revised public procurement rules adopted this month, allowing public sector buyers to privilege companies investing in their workforce, whether through living wages, training or apprenticeships. That's the kind of social Europe that we should be pushing together in the future. So for all these reasons, it's essential that working people vote in these elections. There's a lot at stake. Our investment, our jobs, our rights at work. In these elections, more than any other, because they're proportional representation, every single vote matters. And so I encourage you to use yours to vote Labour for MEPs who are set to work for the benefit of working people in this region, not undermining their jobs and their rights. Please, I've brought some forms with me. Sign up for a postal vote. Get your families and friends to sign up for postal votes. And let's make sure that we return at least 2 Labour MEPs for the North East in May, if not the full gambit. Thanks very much.